A couple of days ago, I found this article by Tech Rights. About 3 days ago, as the recording of this, that was discussing a talk that Stallman did back in 2019. So this talk happened not that long before he got removed from the FSF. The reason why I want to talk about this, even though it's by no means new information, is because I know that I've fallen foul to this, and all of the Stallman detractors have as well, saying that the FSF and Stallman are, I guess, out of touch with technology and don't really understand the issues we're facing today, always harping on about things from the past, the achievements they've had, and issues that don't really matter anymore. And after listening to this talk, which we're not going to play today because it's 24 minutes, I really, really recommend listening to it though, I have completely changed my opinion about Stallman. I think that he is still very much on point, even though he has some, let's say, funky solutions for how these problems can be dealt with. I still think that he is very much heading in the right direction and is still worth listening to. While the FSF is a very small organization, which makes it very difficult to actually make any meaningful change, I think the change they do want to see happen is still something worth supporting. So the first thing that Stallman got into in his talk was about mobile phones, which he described as Stalin's dream device because it has a microphone that is always turned on and always recording, and if it's connected to a cell tower, it's always tracking your location. Now, he mentioned these cell modems are built with a backdoor in them that allows any attacker to just listen in on what the microphone is capturing. And the solution he suggested, rather than doing something at the software level because other software can just mitigate that software, instead doing it at the circuit level and basically just switching off the microphone when it's not in use. Now, I don't know how he was planning to get this actually integrated. He said that they were working on something at the FSF, but he didn't really go into details on what was actually being worked on, and I can't imagine any cell manufacturers willingly integrating that feature into their devices and just losing out on all of that data. And to avoid tracking, he suggests that the cell radio on the phone should be disabled by default unless the phone is in a phone call. Now, this produces an obvious problem where you don't know if anyone wants to call you because your cell radio is disabled and you can't receive a phone call. So his solution to this is, instead of doing that, everyone should carry around a one-way pager, and if you want to call someone, you would then go and page that person, and when that person then goes to somewhere that is a bit less sensitive, like let's say they just go to a park somewhere, then they can go and turn their radio on and actually call the person. Now, this is obviously a funky solution that would never catch on, but you can still see the sentiment there is to avoid being tracked. He also got into a conversation about schools, saying that schools are turning into monsters for imposing massive surveillance on students. Now, do keep in mind that this was back in 2019 when people could actually go to physical classes. This was way before anyone was doing all of their classes online with things like Zoom and literally being required to run Zoom to pass their course. And then also extending into things like online exams where you're basically running a rootkit on your system that tracks every single thing you're doing to make sure you're not cheating in your exam. We can't just, find some other way to get around this, maybe just not doing the exam, maybe trying to do some extra assignments. No. Rootkits are the correct way to do it. Which obviously creates a massive security vulnerability because you're not entirely sure what these applications are actually collecting and how long they're actually keeping records for. And he says that schools are required to maintain student privacy, and in the US, this is actually enshrined in federal law. Basically, by passing along personal information of the students to companies like Google, you're basically breaking this law. The way that he says they avoid doing this, though, is by effectively appointing these companies as officers of the school, and by being officers of the school, they would then obviously be allowed to see the data. Now, I wasn't actually able to find any sources on this actually happening. If someone happens to know more about this, please do let me know. And he says when schools create an email account in some company, in this case for the student, they also violate the student's privacy because this account is going to be used to send along things like the student's assignments, their grades, and anything else that is very much personal information to that student while they're actually at the school. And this could pretty easily be dealt with, actually, if a school just had a decent IT team. Basically, they could just host the email servers internally. The problem is that a lot of schools are very underfunded, and the IT teams they usually have basically do the bare minimum work they need to do. And while he didn't bring this up in his talk, it also applies to video conferencing as well. But in the case of video conferencing, there's basically no reason to not be self-hosting it, because in the case of something like Jitsi, even though you might need a bunch of servers to do it, it's pretty much just plug and play. Now, he says the FSF was actually in the process of organizing against this, trying to get students and parents involved, making it so it would be socially unacceptable for schools to go and send all of the students' data to whatever company wants that data. I don't know how successful this would have been. I don't know how much change it would have made, but it certainly would have at least drawn some attention to this actually being an issue that does need to be dealt with. Over the past year and a half or so, there has been some attention actually put towards this, especially with the growth of things like Zoom, where it had its end-to-end encryption, where the encryption keys were being shared from a central server, which is not end-to-end encrypted whatsoever. That became a problem, but people are still using Zoom. Zoom has completely recovered from it. There is a bit of noise, but not enough to make any reasonable change. I do hope that as time goes on, there is more people who do start to talk about this, and it actually does become something that does become socially unacceptable. He then got into the problem of general surveillance from software, saying that many software and services spy on their users because entities want that data. So that data can be sold to data brokers, and so the FBI can go and then take that data from those companies or from the data brokers and basically do whatever it is they want to do with it. And breaking up the giant corporations like Google wouldn't actually go and address the problem, because if you go and break up Google, they're still going to collect data that's actually relevant to their parts they've been broken up into, and that data can still just then be merged back together, and you haven't solved any problem whatsoever. No matter how many times you subdivide the dataset, if the entire dataset still exists, it can always be merged back together, which is what is being done by the data brokers, because Google doesn't have all the information, Twitter doesn't have all the information, Facebook doesn't have all the information, but when you take all of those data sets and then merge them together, you basically know everything about everyone, which is what the data brokers do to actually make their data actually worthwhile. His solution, which is going to sound like a very far-off, impossible solution, is having a law that makes it so systems are required to not collect data. Now, that's basically impossible in the US because the US is very much funded by Silicon Valley companies, but it's a dream that can be worked towards. Now, he does understand that sometimes data collection actually is a good thing, which when I heard that, I was really surprised. I did not expect that to be said by Stallman. Things like, say, knowing who owns property, for example, or at the border checking passports, things like this, data collection is important, but there should only be little exceptions. It shouldn't just be a general rule that everything can collect data. Because by allowing surveillance like this to continue, every single day you step closer and closer to being a surveillance state like somewhere like China. Now, when I realized that Stallman is still very much in the know about what's happening right now, is when the discussion shifted towards IoT devices, better known as Internet of Things, or as he wanted to call them, the Internet of Spies, or the Internet of Stings, because when you run a device like this, it's always going to come back to bite you, because everything that you're doing with that device is always being reported back to the home server. And not just the central control node, something like an Amazon Echo, but all of the devices in your big Weber devices, all the information is going to be sent back, which gives people a very good understanding about how you actually live your life. So let's say it's 8 p.m. and all your lights in your house are turned off. Well, it's very likely that you're not at home right now. Or let's say that you just bought a pregnancy test. Well, if you bought a pregnancy test, maybe you're expecting a child and now we can start advertising baby clothes to you. All of this information is going to come back and bite you. This is why it's the Internet of Stings. And he says that personal assistants are the nastiest of all. They're not smart devices at all they are listening devices. And he brought up a funny story, which sounds like a very Stallman thing to do, which is that one of his friends apparently owns, I think he said an Amazon Echo or one of these listening devices, and when he's at that person's house, he doesn't speak in the house. If he wants to speak to that person, basically he will take the person outside and talk to them there. I can imagine Stallman actually doing this, and when I imagine it, it's a kind of hilarious scene. I recommend doing the same. His reason for doing this is by accepting it at someone else's house. Basically, he's conditioning himself to accept that this is something that is right to happen. He's conditioning himself to accept that having a microphone in your house all the time is just a normal thing. And he said that friends don't let companies spy on friends. And the problem with having all of these devices webbed together is you have to trust every single piece of software by every single developer on every single one of the devices, because if at any point along that chain there is some vulnerability, that could leak all of the data. Even if, say, you trust your light bulb not to leak data, and you trust your washing machine and your oven not to leak data, well, if the central control node has a vulnerability in it, well, now all of that data is public. And he eventually gets into the issue of free software, saying that free software doesn't fix this issue of trust inherently, but what it does do is give you more people to trust. Rather than just trusting the developer isn't trying to steal your data, now you also have a community of people who are also saying, okay, well, this software seems like it's fine to use, and you can then go and trust those people as well. Basically, it, I guess, decentralizes the trust. And this gives you some level of hope of actually fixing the trust issue. And the last issue we got into was about Australia, which is a country that loves encryption. They love encryption so much, they basically want to break it. If you're going to encrypt something, it has to be built with a backdoor in it, which basically defeats the purpose of the encryption, because when there is a backdoor, even if it's for the government, if the backdoor is there, the backdoor is there and other people will find it. And for things like, say, banking information, that is something that you really don't want to see happen. One of the other problems he brought up is if you are required to build this backdoor, you're then not allowed to actually warn people that your software has been compromised. But here's the problem. This is Australia, and Australia doesn't really have that much power outside of the country. This isn't a country like the US, which can influence the entire world. So what he suggested is basically just warn people outside of the US, and what's Australia going to do? Prosecute people in a different country? Good luck with that. It's not going to work. And by making this a wide enough issue, Australia can't really do anything about it, and eventually has to back down from this stance. Now, countries are not well known for backing down from terrible stances like this, so I'm not really hopeful of that happening, but at least people outside of Australia can warn people about the problem. Now, while both the FSF website and the GNU website look like they're straight out of the 90s and honestly really need a redesign, I take back what I've said in the past that I think that Stallman and the FSF are basically out of touch. I feel like I was just being dragged along by what other people are saying and didn't do enough research into it myself to really form a proper opinion. I think that while Stallman has some funky ideas about how things can be dealt with, he's still basically on point about the direction you should be heading. Even though the solutions aren't workable, I think that by going in that direction, you can work towards a better situation. As I said at the start, I highly recommend listening to the talk yourself, which will be linked in the description down below. And if you want to let me know what you think about it, let me know in the comment section as well. So I think that's going to be pretty much everything for me. And before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim, Donald, Logan, Michael, Andre, Nathan, David, Carl, Will, Brennan, Chicabeto, Jamie, Joseph, Josh, Mitchell, Peter D, Stephen Tees, Thoreau, Tony Tushar, and all of my $2 supporters. If you'd like to go support work, the links down below to my Patreon, subscribe, start, LibrePay, all that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere. I've also got a gaming channel where... Oh, my camera just cut out. I've also got a gaming channel where I play games on Twitch and on YouTube. That is Brodie Robertson Plays. And if you'd like to watch this channel on a platform that isn't YouTube, that is available over on Odysee. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.